Okay, so sometimes it might be helpful to do a little bit of an outline before you actually start writing. So I know I told you that you do not have to draft in order, and you don't, but it might be helpful to know sort of what points you have to hit 8 pages. So what I'm going to show you here is a little a little outlining technique that I like to do for myself. Works for me. It's worked for lots of other students. If you find that this is not helpful, then you don't have to keep watching. But if you do, then please keep watching. And I think that maybe this will help sort of give you what you might need to kind of get started. So we have 8 pages, and really going on to the 9th page just to be sure we have 8 complete pages. So this looks like big blank. Where do we start? Well, we know that on page 1, there is always an introduction, right? So let's go ahead and know that we have to have an introduction on page 1. And then we know at the end of page 8, we have to have a conclusion, right? So we can go ahead and put that there. In fact, we might just want to go ahead and drop that down a little bit because we'll want it near the end so that on page 9, conclusion concludes, right? Okay. Yes, I know I spelled it wrong. Okay. So we have those things set, okay? Now, you have, so if you're doing a good introduction, this is probably going to take up, probably with the heading and the title, this is probably going to take up about 3/4 of the page, even to the whole page. Now, what goes into an introduction? Well, you've got to introduce the topic, the research, question, or idea. You're going to talk about why it's relevant, why it's important, and you're also going to give us your sort of thesis statement, which we'll work more on in the next module. So your thesis statement is sort of going to be a culmination of what you've found as you've researched. So your question, you're just going to invert that into a thesis statement. You'll invert it into a statement. So if my question was, do poetry textbooks actually help young poets write poetry? If I found that the answer was yes, then my thesis statement, and this is very oversimplified for the sake of example, but my thesis statement would be something like, poetry textbooks have been proven to help young poets write more poetry, better poetry, because, and then I would list some reasons. And that's a very simple example of a thesis statement. So you would give that there. And then you would go into, of course, talking about your points, talking about those subtopics. So if I want to drop down here, I know that the introduction is going to take up probably about 3/4 of the page to a whole page. I know I need at least one more point to fill up page 1. So I'll just put point 1. And then what are you going to talk about here? So I would just put point 1, and then you can leave a blank here to put like what you're going to talk about. And then go ahead and say, what sources am I going to use to support this point? And then you can list those there. Okay, and that should complete page 1. So you have a whole page now. Come over to page 2. You can keep going with point 1 because that's probably going to be what happens. And I'll say each point, if it's fleshed out well enough, will probably take up 3/4 to 2 pages. Okay, 3/4 of a page to 2 pages. So I'm just going to go in the middle here and put, 1 page per point. Now look, this is not me telling you you need 1 page per point. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. People who have very specific topics might find that they have to get very detailed with their points, okay, with their talking about their subtopics. So that might mean that they have 3, okay, and that might be enough for them to take up 9 pages because they're being very detailed, they're being very thorough, they're having to get into the actual like nitty-gritty stuff, okay? But some people who have topics that are a little bit more broad might actually find that because their topic's so broad, they don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty, very detailed, nuanced aspects of their topic, and so they have to have more points because there's not as much time to flesh it out in order for them to cover all they need to cover, okay? So for our example, I'm trying to find sort of the average to let you know this is typically on average what I see that papers who meet the page count and they do it well, this is typically how they do it, okay? So we'll just say one page per point, and you adjust it as you see fit, all right? So we come down here, and we know that we have hit 1 page, and so we're going to go to our second point. What is that going to be for you? You write it out here, and then you go ahead and you find the sources from your research that you've done, your bibliography. You go ahead and pick out sources that support this point and you list them. Okay? I will say this. For each point, you need at least one source that supports it, okay? Because though this is a research paper that's supposed to demonstrate your own understanding of the topic, it's supposed to illustrate your own thoughts, your own convictions about it, you've got to have evidence that puts you in that conversation with the other scholars for your points to be valid, right? So I guess an easy way to say this is like if LeBron James and Michael Jordan are arguing about like this basketball play, and I come up and I'm like, no, you're both wrong, right? Okay, I played 8th grade basketball and I sat on the sidelines most of the time. So I'm really not the best person to say what is and is not doable for, that conversation, right? It's LeBron James. It's Michael Jordan. I think they would know because they have all this experience. It's the same thing. You can't come into this conversation and say, no, you're both wrong. This is what I think. Listen to what I think without having some experience, without having some foreknowledge of what's been talked about already and bringing that up to the front and using it to support what you have to say. Your voice matters. What you have to say is valid, is the point, but you can't argue in a vacuum. You've got to pull other sources in with you. So if you find that you have a point that you couldn't find any sources on, then maybe you need to relook at it. Or maybe you need to email me and get some help on finding those sources because you've got to have them, all right? So this point 2 is going to come over to page 3 to finish us up for our average of 1 page per point. And then we'll come down to point 3. And then we'll keep doing that over and over again. I'll say it one more time. Point 3, here's my subtopic. Here's sort of the summary of point 3. And then here are the sources that support this point. Okay, and you can even go as far as to jot down sort of what you want to say here, why you want to say it, and then how the sources sort of inform it, support it, and whatnot. So if I keep doing this all the way to page 8, I'm going to have a total of how many points? Chloe can't do math. So I'm just going to do this, 0.4, etc. Come over here so that I'm not redundant and wasting your time. No worries, that's my dog. He wants inside because it's 60 degrees. He's an old bulldog. He has arthritis. So you can feel sorry for him for me. Now I'm losing track of numbers. Okay, so I'm going to come down here. It looks like we're going to have probably 7 points to get to page 9 if we do an average of 1 page per point. All right. Again, that number is going to be very, very adjustable for you. That's your variable. That can go however way you need it to go. Okay. The main thing is you need to know sort of what points you've got going for you, how many you have at this point, and then sort of gauge as you're drafting, how many more points do I need to generate to meet this page count? And it might sound like I'm speaking sort of out of turn when I talk about meeting page count, but that's just the facts of life, right? I mean, you've got a page count you've got to meet. You don't meet this page count, you don't get the common grade of B. You definitely don't get the A grade. So that's something you have to think about. And in your other courses, in your career, maybe you've got to cover a certain amount of topics, certain amount of pages. That's just something that we have to deal with, right? So I don't mean to take the magic out of it and talk about. I just want to be helpful with it, So as you draft, you don't have to start at any specific point, but it might be helpful to know this is sort of what I've got going for me. I know that, hey, today I'm not feeling very inspired, so I'm just going to kind of write the introduction. Or, you know what, I know the big picture, but I haven't really had time to sort of delve into the details yet. I'll just kind of type out the conclusion and, see if it all meets back around after I finish drafting. So that would be what I would do. Okay. And if you use one source per point, you've got 10 sources. So say you use one source per point. For this outline, you've used 7 sources. So you've got 3 extra sources that you can do sort of add in here or there. Another point, just to kind of throw in, this thing's about to cut me off, so really fast. You can use quotes and sources in your introduction and your conclusion, but here's a tip. This is your paper. This is your voice. This is your research. You want to be in conversation with other authors, with other scholars, but ultimately, this is what you have to say about it. So you need their support. You need to stand on research that's already been done, but you're adding to that research. So do not start the essay with someone else's voice, with someone else's quote, and do not end the essay with someone else's voice or someone else's quote. Make sure it's your own voice, make sure it's your own thoughts, and make sure that you are establishing the significance, the urgency, the relevancy. You are doing that yourself because, like I said, we're in the conversation, but when it comes down to it, you're the one saying, okay, this is what I think, right? And come back to that dinner party scenario that we talked about earlier, where you walk into that dinner party, there's discussions going on both ways. People have taken sides and they're like, what do you think? And you're like, I don't know. What are you talking about? This is where, you've listened to the conversation, you've heard both sides, you've communicated both sides to your readers. Now you get to say, okay, here's what I think. And that's the conclusion for you. Okay. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope that you have an easy time drafting. I know sometimes drafting can feel like pulling teeth. But once you get past this, it gets easier. We get to fix, we get to revise, we get to revisit, we get to brainstorm. And that's a lot easier than getting the initial stuff on paper. So just know that if it's hard for you, join the club. It's hard for everyone, and we can get through it together. Okay? All right. Hope this was helpful. I'll see you in the modules.